to run the crew in the summer to maintain about 75 commercial and residential properties in the Scottsbluff area. Lot of on-the-ground work as far as hands-on pruning and just being practical with getting your job done. My goal is not for you to walk away being a mad scientist about trees, but to walk away understanding the consequences of the choices that you make. You know, everything, you do something to a tree and it's going to respond. And hopefully you have a better understanding of what that response could look like, depending on what choice you decide to make with that tree. So to start off, oh, this doesn't, wrong button. We'll do this. Sorry, Lyle, I ditched your chair. There, that one works. One of the 5 has to work, right? So making sure that we're all on the same page, understanding the terms that I'll be talking about. Crown is everything living, all the leaves at the top of the tree. Of course, we know what the trunk is. The root collar is down here at the bottom. So if you think about it, the tissue that your fingernails are made out of is different than the tissue that your skin's made out of. Trunk tissue is different than root tissue. At that root collar is where that tissue changes from being trunk to root tissue. If that collar is below ground, root tissue is meant to be wet, but it still has to have oxygen to be able to dry out in between. Trunk tissue, on the other hand, is not meant to be wet for long periods of time, which is why we say don't pile the mulch up around it. If you put on wet socks and you work all day, you're going to be all wrinkly and gross. If you put mulch up around the base of a trunk that's not meant to be wet for long periods of time, you're going to soften that material and increase the likelihood of having problems with that tree. The drip line, if you go to the ends of the branches and draw a line, imaginary line down, and then everything around it is what we call the drip line. That's also the critical root zone. So if you're going to be doing any work around the tree, if you can stay out of that area, that's where the primary roots are going to be that are going to have a significant impact on that tree's health if they were damaged. On the attachment of a branch to the trunk, we have on the top side what we call the branch bark ridge, which is where the tissue comes up to a ridge, and then on the bottom side is what we have, we call a collar. So we want a dominant leader in our trees. On occasion, when our trees are not pruned properly for structure when they're young, we end up with what we call a co-dominant leader. And we can have many co-dominant leaders. And that basically just means that the tree was not kept in check when it was young. And the reason why it causes problems is because those root collars, or the trunk, or the branch collars, do not form at the bases of the attachments. And so if you cut that, you're going to increase the likelihood of having rot go down into the cut that you just made. On the trunk, these first branches, they're technically called scaffold branches, and then the seconds are laterals. I call them primary branches and secondary branches, which is important for when I explain things later. So on the tree itself, the only part that is actively living and growing is this. So if you're mowing or you're weed trimming and you're hitting that tree over and over again, you're cutting all of that tree's vascular system to be able to transport water and nutrients up and down that tree. You're increasing the likelihood of killing that tree every single time you hit it with a mower, because that is the only part that's growing. Everything on the inside, that is dead tissue in the center. It's called the heartwood. And then the next layer is the sapwood. If you're going to get sap out of a tree to make syrup, that's where you're going to find it, is in that layer. That's moving water and nutrients, but in order to keep creating those layers, we know how old a tree is by the number of rings that a tree has. And so this layer is what is creating those rings every single year. So if you damage that layer, you are reducing that tree's ability to continue to grow and to continue to put on new layers of sapwood. In the top of the canopy, if you see upright attached branches, usually they have really thin, smooth bark on them. This is what we call water sprouts, or epicormic sprouting. They are typically a response to stress, and they are there intentionally to temporarily make food. Think of the leaves as the food factory of your tree. When you remove a big branch, you're removing a large portion of that tree's ability to make food. But you also have to think about the branch itself and how much sugar and how much food is stored. So the branches are like the pantry of the tree, and the leaves are like the factory of the tree. You've got to have leaves to be able to store or make food to be able to store it. So if you remove too much off of a tree, it's going to go into panic mode. And it's going to start sending all these sprouts because it says, oh gosh, I don't have enough of the factory to be able to make enough food to be able to store it. Or you've just taken away too much of my stored food that for me to continue to sustain life, I now need to replace that factory that I just lost as quickly as I possibly can, which is a big problem because they're not very well attached. Rapidly growing, weakly attached. Now, if they're at the bottom of the tree, those are what we call sucker sprouts. And this can happen if a tree is planted too deep, if somebody's been hitting it with a mower too many times. Again, it's another sign of stress. A lot of times this happens on our grafted trees. You'll see it on crab apples all the time because in order for them to guarantee you the exact crab apple that you went to the store to buy, they went to a mother plant, they cut off a little root tip, and they gave it its own root system because you can fuse skin to skin and roots can fuse to each other, but you cannot fuse a fingernail to your skin. So they fuse trunk tissue to trunk tissue. They take a Dolgo crabapple typically, chop the top of it off, take that cutting from the parent plant, and they put it on the root system, and they fuse them together. And sometimes that fusion doesn't go the best, and so then you have stress because your tree is not able to get the nutrients that it needs. So then we end up with the suckering. If you have a tree that's suckering and it's young, you just planted it a couple years ago, ask yourself, do you want to live the next 25, 30 years having to cut those suckers off? Or would you rather just take the dang thing out and go and get a new one that is on what we call a root right stock, which is found to not sucker as much? Get a tree that's not going to cause you a lot of maintenance. Start out the right way in the beginning. It's important to know your tree's natural form, how it's going to grow. So things like linden, pine, and spruce, they naturally want to have one central leader, and they usually are pretty good about maintaining one nice central leader. However, our elms, hackberries, maples, white oak, they want to have multiple different leaders. They want to be kind of a big, round, oval shape, and so it's what we call a decurrent growth, and these are the ones that usually cause us the most problems when they are not properly maintained when they're younger. However, you have to keep in mind site context. So Lyle was just saying that over by the pickleball courts, there's been some trees that were removed, and there were trees, in the center that those other ones were protecting. Now we had the storm that came through. Those trees have not been living their whole life with that force. They are not adapted to that force that they've now been exposed to. So the likelihood of them failing has increased significantly. So we've got two of the same kind of tree, white oak. You've got one that grew out in the open, and then you've got a tree that if I pulled one out of the forest, that's been growing where they're really tight together, they naturally create pressure. Most of the trees that we plant in town, they're coming from a forest. In Nebraska, we're the Plains State. We're the home of Arbor Day, not because we have a lot of trees. We're the home of Arbor Day because we have to plant trees in the environments we choose to live in. And so we pull trees out of their natural environment that they've been living all these years, adapted to living close together, and we put them out in the open, and they're like, oh, this is nice. And then they end up with really bad structure that ends up breaking in our storms. And so we have to do a lot of management, especially when they're young, to get them set up properly. We have to be the one providing that pressure, because when they're next to each other, the only place they're going to get sunlight is up. And so they're going to keep pressure from having those branches get too long and lanky on the bottom sides. But as soon as you remove all of those trees around that one that was slender, then you're going to have issues, and I'll show you in just a second. This is a tree up by O'Neill. family farm, beautiful bur oak tree out in the open. It's kind of short, fat, squatty. These trees right next to it are really close to each other, probably the exact same round of genetics, but they're growing in a different environment. So they're much more taller, they have shorter branches, and they're less likely to break in our windstorms, our ice storms, our snow roads, all of those things. Now this is what I was talking about. So Dr. Ken James does a lot of research on tree biomechanics, which is how does a tree respond to different types of forces in the way that it grows. And if you take out all of the other trees, basically your singular pendulum, it moves like this, which increases the likelihood of it snapping during a windstorm or during any other kind of force. If you think about a big tree that's got all of its branches, it is doing a mass dampening effect, and I'll show you that in just a second. But all of the branches are moving at the same time, flexing and reducing the likelihood of it having breakage during our storms. But we have to have what we call taper in our branches. So the end of the branch is skinny and the base of the branch is thick. Same thing with our trunks. The top of the tree is skinny and the base of our trunk is thick. If you think about if I put my feet together and you push me, I'm not going to be able to stop myself from falling over. If I have my feet separated and you push me, I can stop myself pretty easily. So if you think about that as far as our trees, when you plant trees too deep in the ground, they look like a telephone pole. You literally just buried the tree's feet together in the ground, and the likelihood of it snapping has increased significantly. Now, the mass dampening effect, when you think of my hand is the leaves, my arm is the branch, and my body is the trunk. The wind is moving the leaves, and there's a lot of motion here, and the motion reduces as it gets closer to my trunk. It's the same thing with our branches. So if you think about, everybody says, oh, well, you need to open up trees so the wind can get through them better and not cause any problems. Wrong. You're going to increase the likelihood of that branch breaking by removing those inner branches. Paying attention to the angle at which the branches are attached, that goes back to the branch bark ridge, and I'll show that in a minute. We also want to try and make sure that our trees are balanced with branches all the way around on all sides. So more about that branch bark ridge, which is on the top, and the branch collar on the bottom. So the branch collar is a collection of cells that are automatically ready to go. As soon as you prune that branch off, those cells are going to be activated to create a callus over the injury that you just created, to be able to put new layers of growth over the top of the injury that you just created, to stop any rot from going in between. If you cut off that collar, you are removing the tree's natural built-in system to protect itself. If you leave a branch stub cut like this, the collar can't grow out and around it. So that's something I'll show you a little bit closer. But the reason why the branch angle, matters is because if it is too close and you end up with two branches growing and they keep growing in diameter, eventually they're going to meet each other and they're going to lock bark in between them. And then there's not going to be any kind of connection. Because if you have a ridge, you end up with these annual growth rings overlapping, and they are creating this nice strong bond between the branch and the trunk. If you don't have that, you have less of an attachment. Think about this. This whole thing is the strength of it. Right here, this is the only piece that's attached. So the likelihood you have included bark right here, this dark line, that's where bark was trapped in between the trunk and the branch because of the branch angle, or just because it never produced a branch bark ridge on the top side. So pruning generally is strategic intentional wounding. Trees respond to cuts with growth no matter what, because they have to recover from the loss of the stored food in the bark and the food factory that's in the leaves. If you're using pruning equipment, bypass pruners is the best because it is going to create a nice clean cut. If you have anvil pruners that come together, they're going to crush that tissue and they're going to damage it. You might as well have not even just tried cutting it off because you've just injured the tissue that was there to make the cut. The most important thing on this list is the gloves. When I was working for the landscaping company, I was cutting down a branch to fit in the back of the pickup, and I ran the saw across the back of my hand. Called my boss. I said, well, I gotta go get stitches. See, first question out of her mouth, were you wearing your gloves? Nope. So, especially if you're using these saws that have the big teeth, make sure that you have gloves, especially a chainsaw. If you don't have your proper PPE on, which I'm sure you all know very well. Trees have the ability to compartmentalize decay that gets into the vascular system. So think about a submarine. It gets hit and it starts taking on water. You can shut the doors on the submarine to try and contain where the water has entered. Trees have the same ability. Some are really good at it, some are really bad at it. Hackberry, silver maple, they are terrible. You will probably always end up with rot going down if you make too big of a cut on those trees. Things like an oak, they're pretty good at compartmentalizing decay. And basically what this is that there's 4 different walls. Wall 1 is stopping the movement from going up and down the trunk. The second wall is stopping it from going clockwise, which is B. And then A is stopping it from going into the new growth that comes on each year. And then C is stopping it from going back inward. So that new layer of growth is that outside edge. And that would be, this is a great example of how this tree used all of those walls to stop any sort of decay from going back. It's a chemical reaction that they can do, but that's only if they were pruned properly. This collar is what produces that 4th wall and that new layer of growth over the top of it. Again, if you cut the collar off, you're removing that tree's ability to do that. This is called heading or topping. This is where you just arbitrarily cut the top of a tree off. You are not going back to a side branch. You are just cutting it because that was the spot that looked good to cut it. And this is a big problem because a tree is going to respond with growth every single time you cut it. How it's going to respond depends on where you cut it. So we do not do heading or tipping cuts because this is what happens. Remember I said the only part of the tree that is growing is right underneath the bark. And everything in the middle, the center core, is dead tissue. This is called the heartwood. It's bone, basically. It's the part that's giving the tree strength. But it cannot stop decay because it doesn't have active doors to be able to do that. The only part that has active doors is the sapwood that's on the outside. So what we end up with are these sprouts that are growing off of, it's called the cambium, the layer that's actually growing, and the attachment is really poor. And so then you end up with decay going down a column all the way down into the branch because the tree, there's no collar in that spot. There's no tissue predetermined to cover up that spot. So then when you end up with storms, ice load, snow, wind, anything else, the likelihood of them falling and breaking during that is significantly higher. So you've just created a really big problem for yourself. And you've also created a lot more work, and that's not what we want to do. So when you're doing any kind of pruning, especially like around power lines, a light post, or anything else, it's critical that you come back to the next branch, not cut in between the attached branches. Because if you cut in between the attached branches like these, you're going to end up with this excessive sprouting. And then those sprouts, because again, you've removed the tree's ability to recover itself. So now it's going into panic mode, and it's trying to get enough nutrients in that location where you've made that cut to be able to recover, because now it's got to work overtime to be able to seal over that injury that was made. Here's a tree in Scottsbluff. You can see all these tiny little branches that are just starting to come off on these other sides. Those are not sprouts. Those are actually branches because they've made proper cuts. You can see where they cut off here, and this is the next branch that's growing in the direction away from the line. So how do we actually prune correctly? On the branch, the way I explain it is if my hand is the branch, or sorry, my arm is the branch and my hand is on the trunk. Look at the branch, where it continues to go straight on both sides. It goes straight and then it starts to curve. It goes straight and it starts to curve. Draw a line between those 2 points, and that's where you're going to make that cut. So here on this branch, you can see this yellow line, it's going straight, and then right here it starts to curve. It's going straight and it starts to curve. So those are your 2 points, and that's where you're going to make your cut. Because that's telling you that you are outside of that branch collar. You are not going to cut it up. If you go straight down the tree, you've just completely removed that collar, which is not going to do good things. When you leave the collar, over time, it creates this nice callus, and it can completely cover up that wound. These are the types of cuts that we want to see. Now, you can kind of tell sometimes, say you got a little too close on one side, it'll be kind of an irregular shape where it'll be thin on the top, thin on the bottom, and then you'll have really wide, nice calluses on the sides, but not on the top and bottom, which tells you that you still got a little bit too close. The only way to get this right is to practice it and keep trying and paying attention to what cuts you made before and seeing what you did or did not do correctly. The tree is going to tell you pretty quick. It's just knowing how to read the tree and understand what it's saying. However, not all branch angles are easy and don't follow the textbook rules. Nobody does. So sometimes you just have to make the best cut possible. Here's a branch. You can kind of see my saw marks. I'm not worried about that piece of that branch that's left over. I have this callus tissue that's starting to grow. It's not as thick on this side, but it is on this side. Eventually, that tree's going to completely swallow that cut off, and you're not even going to know. It's going to be in the middle of the tree, and until you take a sawmill to it and cut it open, you won't even know that that was there. That's the goal. These are all the ways not to do it. The first one is called bark tear out. So that living layer right underneath the bark has a lot of moisture in it. And if you do not remove the weight off of that branch before you make that final cut, you are very likely going to peel the bark off on the bottom side of that branch along the trunk. So I'll show you in a second how to properly do that. This is what we call a flush cut. That's where you cut straight down and you remove the whole collar of the branch. Otherwise, a stub cut, Mother Nature made this stub cut, but the collar can't grow out and around that. So you've got issues with your tree being able to cover that up. So here you can see there's a really bad bark tear out. It just ripped it all the way down the bottom side of that branch. So what we use is called the 3-cut method. The first cut is underneath through at least a third, if not half, the diameter of the branch. Go out a little ways on the top side and make the cut, because what that does is it makes this nice hinge to be able to control the fall of your branch, rather than having it like, oh, I think it's going to fall there. Instead, it's going to control the fall. And then you go back to the trunk and make your final nice cut outside of that collar where you're not going to have any issues. So when we're training our young trees, and even when you're pruning your big old trees, their number one goal is to promote strong structure. We don't want to create trees that are going to fail in the next windstorm. We want to make sure that they're set up to be able to withstand all of the different forces that they could experience in Nebraska. So when we're doing young trees, and like I said, they get out there in the open and they just want to, stretch out, we need to remind them, we need you to become tall, not short, fat, and wide. We need you to get tall because we've got to have clearance. Because if we have our trees get too big, too short, we're going to have a lot of really big cuts that are unnecessary. That tree just built a lot of infrastructure that you're just going to remove anyways. And so we want to keep our trees from doing that. But by developing and maintaining a dominant leader, identifying the lowest branch in the permanent canopy, and I'll explain that more here in a second, but the permanent canopy, where is your clearance? Which is the branch that is going to be there for the whole 50, 60 years of that tree's life? So figure out when they're young, which branch that is, depending on where the tree is planted. The branches below that, keeping them short. They're temporary. The tree still needs a food factory while it's young to be able to get big, but we don't want the tree storing a lot of food in those lower branches. We want the tree using that energy to get taller. So that way we don't have as many issues with lower branches. Making sure that branches are spaced nicely along the main trunk. keeping all the branches less than half the diameter of the trunk. That comes into play especially during our snow load events or ice load events, because if you have a branch that's more than half the diameter of your trunk, the connection between them becomes significantly weak, and the likelihood of that branch peeling off in that storm is very high. So you don't want branches bigger than half the diameter of the trunk. Suppressing the growth, which is just slowing it down. Any of those branches that have that included bark, like I was showing, it doesn't have a very good attachment. The two different types of cuts, I've already talked about this one. You come back to the next branch, or you're coming back to the primary branch that the secondary was attached to. So a reduction cut or a removal cut. If you guys have questions, please stop me. Okay, directional pruning. Pay attention to which way the branch or the bud is pointed when you prune back to it. Because if you've got a building and you don't want the branches to keep going towards the building, then don't prune back to a branch that's pointed towards the building. Prune back to a branch that's pointed upward, so that way you can redirect the growth upward. On a branch, a tree, everything, if you take the sides off, it's going to get taller. If you take the top off, it's going to get wider. So just keep that in mind when you're removing which direction is the tree going to respond with growth. So as a tree is total, let's say that these are temporary branches that nobody's touched in a long time. I need this tree to get taller. So I'm going to slow down these bottom branches by cutting them back at least half their length. And I'm telling the tree, stop putting energy in these bottom branches and redirect your energy up into the top of the tree. Same thing goes though for a branch alone. If I take this back to here, this is now the new leader of that branch. So whatever direction that one is pointed is where the growth is going to continue to get longer. Subordination cuts is a fancy term of just slowing down. We're using cuts to slow down the growth of branches, and that's on those lower ones. If you have what we called earlier the codominant, it's basically an extension of the stem. There is no collar around the base of that attachment. And so the likelihood of you ending up with what the included bark in between increases, which increases the likelihood of your tree splitting open. We want to make sure that they have what is called the branch defense zone, which is that collar. This is an interesting thought. You can see this nice big crack in this tree. This is more research with Dr. Ken James. So when that crack happens, if you think about the tree as a whole, as a circle, when the tree is still together, it's got 100% of its structural integrity. As soon as that crack happens, you're not losing 50% of that structural integrity. You're actually losing 80% of it. Because this side has 20% on its own, this side has 20% on its own. This beautiful red line is the crack, but the center of it is where the tree is giving a combined force of 60%. So when you do have a tree that cracks, is it a smart idea to leave the other side of it standing? Not usually. At that point, unfortunately, the whole tree needs to come down. So I talked about the diameter. Here we've got two codominants. That's not a branch. That's a second leader. Now we have a branch on this side. It's less than half the diameter of our trunk. Somebody tell me how many branches are on that picture.
3.
You say 3? You say 4? 1. There's 1 branch on that picture. Because each codominant stem is connected to 50% of the trunk below it. So right here at this connection, those are almost 1-to-1. At this connection, those are almost 1-to-1. 1-to-1. This is the only branch on that entire stem. So these don't have very well developed collars, if any at all. And so if you think about on a tree itself, you can have multiple codominants. It's not just 2 primary branches coming up in the center of the tree. So we want to tell these branches, quit trying to be a leader. and we slow them down. And I'll show that in a second. But if you end up with a U shape, it said that you have enough of a bark ridge in the middle, which is that nice connection between the two of them, so they're holding each other together. Whereas if you have a sharp V, this tree is kind of SOL. There's not a lot that can be done with that other than reducing the weight that is on those branches, and letting the tree live as long as it can. And if there's something underneath it that it could possibly fail on, then that's when you need to decide, is it probably safer to remove the tree rather than let it stand and wait for it to fail on its own. This, on the other hand, we've got 2 leaders, and I just said you turn a leader into a branch by slowing it down. So if I take the end of this branch off, it's going to create a branch, if I take the lead off of this leader, it's going to create a branch out of this, and it's going to redirect the growth back into the primary stem. The primary stem will continue to get bigger and bigger, while that smaller size branch is not going to grow at the same rate. It's going to slow it down because I took the end of that branch off. So when I walk up to a tree and I'm looking at it for structure, the first thing I look for is the outside of our tree. Where are my leaders? Where are the branches that are the tallest, reaching to the outer edge of the canopy? And then where are they attached? And most commonly, they are attached at the lowest point in the canopy. If you think about a diving board, I stand at the base of that diving board and I move my weight. It's not going to move very much. But if I walk all the way out to a really, really long diving board and I barely move my weight, the whole diving board is going to move. So that's the length of the lever arm. So if you think about these branches that are attached clear at the bottom of the canopy, they are reaching all the way to the top of the tree, that's a really long lever arm, which increases the likelihood of it snapping during a storm. We don't want those big long branches. So on the C, it gets cut back because there's already another branch attached to the trunk right there. We don't want 2 of them attached to the trunk at the same spot. A, on the other hand, has this nice side branch pointed in the direction that we want the growth to go. And so we can do a reduction cut and bring it back. And now we have a nice, strong central leader in B. Overall, when you're pruning on the trees, general rule of thumb is don't do more than 25% of the canopy. Don't remove more than 25% of the canopy. Don't remove more than 25% of the food factory. That's the way to think about it. Use those cuts, the slow down or subordination cuts, to be able to say, okay, look at this branch. This branch is on the outside. I have 1 branch here, 1 branch here, 1 there, and 1 here. Those are kind of all my leaders. Those are all the ones that are coming off, and they're the same diameter at the point of the trunk that they're attached to. I need to slow them down. So I'm just going to take the ends off and come back to the next side branch. I do have a U shape starting here at the top, so I want to slow one of them down and turn it into a branch. I don't want you to be a leader. So this is going to redirect that growth up into that top central leader the way that we want it to grow. This is a new concept that I started using to explain because I'm very visual, and I like to communicate visually. When I look at a young tree, and I'm trying to figure out which branches need to be pruned, if this tree was in the forest, this is the type of pressure that it would be getting from its neighbors. But it doesn't have neighbors, so we have to be the ones giving that tree the pressure. So I've started calling this spearheading, which is basically we have 1 central leader, and you draw a spear. Because everything down here, I need to take all of these branches that are out here, and I need to bring them back. So that way they're in the right hierarchy. Because if I leave them alone, they're going to become new leaders. I don't want this tree. This tree is probably 20 feet tall. It's right next to my house. I need that first primary branch attached at minimum, probably 15 feet high. And so my first primary branch is somewhere up here, and it's a twig. So in the meantime, I need to make sure that this tree is not storing a lot of energy in these lower branches. But the tree still needs the factory to live. And so I'm just shortening them to slow down their rate of growth and redirecting that energy upwards. On trees that have decurrent growth, like the elms and the honey locust and everything else, the goal is to get one nice strong central leader at least up to 20 feet high in the canopy. I'll explain that with this. So the height at which a branch is attached to the trunk controls how big that branch is going to get. If the branch is attached low in the canopy, the likelihood of that branch getting really big is really high. The chances of it getting really big when it's higher up in the canopy is really low. And so a lot of the problems we have come from branches stemming all at the base of the crown, too close to the bottom, and they're all the same size. So they're not very well attached, and they're more likely to fail and fall apart. So the higher up, that's why we try and train that leader at least up to 20 feet high in that canopy. What we don't want is a candelabra tree, which is where nobody's touched it. You have all of these branches, all these leaders that are attached to the bottom of the canopy. But we keep these lower branches shortened because we don't want to remove them. We don't want to clear the trunk, because the point at which that branch is attached to the trunk is where it is storing energy. And in order to get a nice trunk taper, where it's wider at the base and narrow at the top, you need to keep a food factory attached to the bottom of that trunk to be able to build it up while the tree is young. So everybody walks up to a tree and the first thing they want to do is start trunk clearing. You are removing that tree's ability to make a nice strong base. And so keep them short inside of the mulch ring, so you're not hitting them when you're mowing. Your trees should have mulch rings. And then basically use the spearheading to get that leader back in order and the rest of them back in order in the hierarchy. They are not leaders, they're followers, they're branches. So again, walking up to the tree, checking out all of my outside. I've got a leader, a branch that's out here getting really long, attached to the bottom of the canopy. That needs to be slowed down. I just need to take it back, get it back in order. This is hard to see, but there are 3 leaders coming, or 3 co-dominant stems, which are extensions of the main trunk. We just need to take 2 of them and bring them back and turn them into branches. They don't need to be removed off all the way. That would be removing a lot of stored food and a lot of the food factory. So a good quality shape is where all of your branches are in check behind your leader, but these lower branches are kept on to continue to feed the trunk while the tree is young. Yes, eventually they will come off, but while your tree is young, it needs those branches to be able to produce food and store it in the trunk. This is where we've got this is like a candelabra that I was talking about. We got all these branches attached at the same point, the lowest point in the canopy. This is a tree that somebody brought home from the nursery and they never touched it again. That tree just is like, everybody's like, it's a free-for-all. They're all trying to be a leader. It doesn't have the natural pressure that it was genetically wired to have, so you have to be the pressure. Now, in the nursery, this is a practice commonly used, and you're going to find this when you go buy your trees. And it's important to understand how this works. When they start out with a little tiny sapling, remember when I said that you take the top off and the sides go out? That's what they're doing here. So they're taking the top of this branch off back to a bud, and those buds on the sides are going to initiate new branches. And then they keep taking the top off of every single one of those until you end up with a shape that looks like a tree. Because nobody wants to go to the store and buy a stick. Everybody wants to buy a cute little tree. So they have forced the tree into a shape that it would not otherwise normally be, because that's what the consumer wants. And so in order to do that, however, sometimes when they cut that off, you end up with all of these different branches sprouting at the same spot, which is a problem. Those are weakly attached. You need to select them out. Now, when they have to retrain a leader, so they take the leader out and they need to make one of those side branches a new leader, they intentionally leave a stub and they take the next softest branch and they tie it up to that stub while it's young, and then over time it hardens off in the upright position. And the end of that branch becomes the new leader of the tree. Over time, what happens is that branch will swallow over the cut if the cut is made. A lot of times when you bring your tree home from the nursery, you're going to still have that little stub. You need to cut that off. So that way this branch, the new leader, and when the tree is the size of your pinky or your thumb, yeah, it looks really crooked, but that tree is going to have a branch this big, and eventually it's going to completely swallow that bend or crick in the branch or in the trunk, and it'll straighten itself out over time. All right. Any questions at this point? Is it too much information? If it is, I'm sorry, because there's more. Okay, so clearance, our objectives with pruning, they can be achieved by shortening the lower branches rather than removing them at the trunk. Use directional pruning. Pay attention to which way the branch is pointed that you're pruning back to. You can slow down those temporary branches, and of course you want to remove them at the trunk before they get to be half the diameter of the trunk. But try and leave them on as long as possible. So here's a tree, started out, we leave these lower branches on. If you have problems with deer, really should leave those branches on. They don't want to rake on a tree that is like a shrub. But if you clear all those branches off, that deer is going to look at that and say, that's a nice spot to rub the velvet off. And you're going to lose all of that tissue that's right underneath the bark that's creating the new layers of sapwood to move the nutrients up and down the tree. So your tree's going to die. Otherwise, again, they are feeding the trunk where they are attached, and so they're helping build that nice equal taper down the bottom of the tree to have a nice strong wide base and a narrower top. But over time, they do come off. So again, permanent branches would be probably up at the top. Permanent branch doesn't even exist on that tree yet, but you can protect the young bark by leaving those on. So let's say that this guy is 6 feet tall. If you double his height, we have 12 feet. Say that we have 14 foot or 16 foot of clearance on the street, and you've got these young trees. Every single one of those is a temporary branch. You do not want to let any of those branches get very long, because they're going to keep getting bigger and bigger. They're all going to come off, at least on this side probably. If you can prune a branch when it's younger, at the time that it's 4 inches, before it gets to be 18, 15, or 12, really a cut like that should never be made on a tree. And I'll explain that in just a second. But even to get clearance on this side, but the thing is, the tree still needs the factory to be able to get to become a big tree. And so it's in its adolescence trying to figure out its life. So keep in mind, what is a primary and what is a temporary branch? This is a honey locust that my in-laws have been working on for the last 5 years. And you can see where I've made cuts in the past. And the amount of growth, this branch is at the bottom of the canopy and these branches are up here at the top. Where I've made those cuts and taken the tip of the branch off, the regrowth is maybe only 3 to 4 inches long. Up in the top of the canopy, where I've redirected the energy to, the growth is probably anywhere from 12 to 18 inches long. So the tree is showing me that by slowing those bottom branches down, yes, it's still going to put on a little bit of growth, but it's not growing at the same rate as the rest of the tree. And so by slowing down the bottom branches, those temporary branches, you're going to redirect that growth up into the top. If you have to raise a tree, depending on the height of the tree, and this is unfortunate when trees are put in the wrong place, is that you should never remove, so the whole 100% height of the crown, the height of the tree, 2/3 of it should be the crown, and 1/3 of it should be like clear trunk. If you have less than 2/3 of the tree's height, that's the whole food factory. If you have a 50% factory to supply a 100% tree, your tree is not going to be very healthy. So the less canopy that you have on the height of your tree, the more likely that your tree is going to be stressed out and not be doing well. So the height or the diameter of the branch that you're removing, the consequences. So when a branch is really little, size of my thumb, it is like 99% sapwood. There's probably not even heartwood that's started to develop in there. So it's all living tissue. It has doors that it can close off to stop decay from moving around. The bigger they get, the more heartwood they have. And so on this branch, I've got all of this heartwood. So the consequences of the size of branch that you remove, if it's less than half the trunk diameter, you're likely going to have few consequences because it has more doors to be able to shut off. But the bigger the branch, if it's large enough to have heartwood, the likelihood of having defects or having rot go down the center, because again, it's dead tissue, down into the column of that tree, you're going to increase the likelihood of fungus, disease, virus, all of the different things that are going to stress out your trees and shorten their lives. So when I said earlier, one of our objectives is to shorten branches before removing them. Taking a branch off at the trunk should be the absolute last option. In any possible case, it should be the last option because of how much heartwood you are exposing. The likelihood, and the thing is that you've done it at the trunk. So if that starts to rot at that cut before it can callus over, it's going right down into the center of your trunk because that branch heartwood is directly tied into the heartwood of your trunk. And so you're going to increase the likelihood of it failing during a storm. So let's say that this is my clearance that I need. I'm going to remove the branch. I'm going to remove secondary branches back to the primary branch, or if I have to, shorten the primary branch to where we're not making cuts bigger than 4 to 6 inches. On this side, I have this much clearance. I've got a branch growing in this direction. I'm going to remove all the branches that are pointed downward. If they keep going, they're just going to keep going down. So directional pruning, paying attention to which way the branch is pointed that you're going to prune back to. Now maybe this one needs to come all the way back so that way this branch continues to be the leader and grows upward. Because if you remove too much, the tree is just going to respond with really rapid sprout growth that is poorly attached, and you're going to have to be back there in less than a year to fix the problem that you just created. If you do it right the first time, the tree is going to shut itself off, it's going to redirect energy, and you're going to have growth up here in the top, rather than these branches continuing to grow. But if you hack it, you're going to have a quick response of growth, because the tree doesn't have, you haven't set it up to be able to close itself off the way it's genetically wired to do so. I cried when I drove into this town, and the street guys did this. All these primary branches, one, when you make a cut, it should be circular. Circles have less area. Ovals have more area. The collar has to grow over the top of that cut. If you have a circle, the collar is going to grow over it faster. If you have an oval, you've probably cut part of the collar off. So they flush cut every single one of these. We counted the rings on one of these big branches. And if I remember right, it was like 23 or something like that. So like those branches were like 23, 24 years old. And what happens is because you've removed that collar, there's no tissue there ready to make that callus. There's nothing there. So the tree goes into panic mode and it starts up a factory to be able to make the callus. Now you have all these poorly attached that are going to fail in the next storm. So this would be like tipping or topping. Same thing. Cut back to the curb. At that point, take it all the way back. Because otherwise, now you're going to end up with all these sprouts coming off the ends of these branches. And then you're really going to be cleaning up branches off the street during the next storm. Whereas if it was just done the right way the first time, the tree would seal itself over and redirect the energy. and you wouldn't have to be back. You wouldn't have regrowth on that side of the tree, again, for probably 3 years at minimum, maybe even 8. So you're reducing the amount of maintenance that you have to do. Now, remember my diving board I was talking about? You put all of the weight at the end of that diving board, and you add just a little bit of force with the wind or ice or snow or anything, and that whole thing is going to move, and the likelihood of it snapping is really high. So this is what we call lion's tailing, and this is where somebody has come in and they've cleared off every single secondary branch and pushed all of the weight to the end of that branch. Don't do that. This is a daycare center. The mayor lived right across the street. I happened to be talking to him, and I looked over and I saw them working on these trees, and they came in and they cleared every single branch off. I'd be horrified. The chances, the increased likelihood of those now failing, that's a high-risk situation that's been created. If that's what you wanted to do with the tree, you might as well just removed it. Now, if a tree is over-pruned, I keep saying it's going to sprout. If you come up to a tree that has already been over-pruned and is already producing a ton of these sprouts, of course we have to manage them. But the problem is, if you cut every single one of them off, they're just going to grow right back. Because the tree is telling you it needs them, because it's trying to get out of a temporarily bad situation. So the tree needs these sprouts, but we need to manage them and try and keep them from all growing off at the same spot. So where you've got 2 of them growing, clip one of them off. Let just one of them grow. When the sprouts get to be more than a 1/4 inch thick, you know, that's the spacing. So these are 1/4 inch thick. When they get to be more than a 1/2 inch thick, then that's when you want to start slowing them down by taking the ends of them off. If you take them off all the way again, they're just going to come back. Because the tree is telling you, I need food and I need resources to be able to recover from the damage that's happened in this location. Maintaining health, removing branches that are over an inch thick that are going inward, like they're going to start growing and hitting the trunk. Any branches that are crossing or rubbing, I said make round cuts earlier, not oval, because they're a smaller wound. Make the smallest cuts possible, ideally 2 inches, sometimes 4, much less often 6. And only when there's absolutely no other option should you be making a cut that's 8 to 10 inches. And if the cut is bigger than that, you are going to shorten that tree's lifespan significantly, because you're going to increase the rate of decay moving into the column, into the trunk of that tree, into the core of that tree. So it better be a mature tree that can handle the loss. When we're cleaning your trees, of course, it's just removing your dead branches. If you've got stubs like this one, you're going to come in and clean it, and you're going to take it back to the collar so it can actually seal over itself. Hangers that are just moving. However, cleaning is not thinning. Sometimes, yes, we do need to thin our trees, but it is done improperly very frequently. Because somebody walks up to the trunk, they stand in the center of the tree, and they start clipping every single branch that's eyesight, or right in the middle of the tree. They forget to step out and look at the tree as a total. You should be pruning more from the ends of the branches than you ever do from the middle of the tree. So if the thinning is done inappropriately, you end up with this open central canopy. If it's done properly, that one and that one look about the same, except this one is less dense than that one because it was done properly. If you do this, you're going to end up with sprouts. This is a crab apple. This is in Bridgeport. This tree is not going to get much taller than that. It's already 25 feet tall. Most crab apples max out at about 30 feet tall. So they've now moved the whole canopy up here, and I was just there not that long ago. They are already resprouting like crazy on the inside. Because those branches, just like the trunk, they need to have food resources right there to continue to build new layers of growth to keep building the caliper of that branch over time. So mitigating risk, we want to remove any compromised branches, watch for fractures or splits. Go back. Sorry. Any of the, like, of course, the widowmakers, and remove the weight on the poorly attached branches. So shorten those branches that are poorly attached. Unfortunately, sometimes you have no other option because Mother Nature, this was Winter Storm Atlas in western Nebraska that had just completely, it looked like a big snow monster just raked the northeast side of these trees and snapped all these branches off. There's no side branches to prune back to. So unfortunately, these branches need to be cut all the way back to the trunk where the collar is to be able to seal over that wound. If a tree is lion-tailed, my question is, what side branches do you have to prune back to in the event that that tree is damaged during a windstorm or a snowstorm or anything? All of those options have been removed. So you don't, again, somebody was in the middle of this tree and they pruned and they cleaned. Rather than taking the weight or the length off of the ends of the branches to maintain the shape and the size of that tree. If this branch breaks right here, this is the only other one here. If the branch breaks here and that comes off, you might as well have a palm tree. All the way, you remember that pendulum tree I was talking about? This is a perfect example of it. If that side branch gets taken off, one, also, okay, so say that's 100% of the tree's growing canopy right now, you remove that side branch, that's more than half of that tree's food factory. So because that tree had already been heavily pruned, all of these big cuts are now sprouting like crazy on the bottom because the tree says, I still need a factory down here to be able to supply food, to be able to build taper in the trunk, to put on new layers of growth each year. This one cracks me up. What you cannot see is the homeowner. I had seen this tree. First time I saw it, I was driving by, headed home, and the crack in it was probably only about 2 feet long. I went by about a week and a half later because I wanted some pictures of it, and the crack is now 6 feet long. What happens is that the branch was too big, it was too long, and a branch is only going to flex downward for so long before it twists. And when it twists, the top of the branch is pulled tight and the bottom of the branch is buckled so that it pops it open. And it gives you this horizontal crack in the branch. And a lot of times you don't see them because they're high up in the tree. But this one was right over the sidewalk, pretty, look at how low that branch is attached and the diameter of that branch compared to the trunk where it is. It's more than 50%. The owner, I did not know when I got out of the truck, and my colleague said, be careful, was standing right on the front porch, and his Harley Davidson was sitting right here underneath this branch. And I said, you might want to move that. He's like, I got insurance. I was like, yeah. Just in a week and a half, that crack went from, it's going to break. I went by another week later, and they had removed it. But again, same thing. So the top is stretched, and the bottom is buckled, and so it pops it open. If you see this in a branch, get it removed. Now, pruning on our evergreens. You always want to prune back to the next living side bud or branch. If you leave stubs, they're going to just be dead. The tree has absolutely no mechanism to close those off. So you want to come back to another branch attachment. And in our big evergreens, we have what's called the dead zone. Evergreens always have weight on their branches, so you should always be using the 3-cut method because it will still peel them, or it'll snap them. So take the weight off the branch with the 3-cut method before making the final cut at the base of the trunk. But I just mentioned the dead zone on our branches and evergreens. So all of this living growth is out here on the end, and especially on blue spruce. If you look at the inside of that blue spruce, the inner 2/3 of that branch does not have anything living on it. If you prune back into that space, nothing is going to happen. If you have to prune into that space, you might as well just remove the whole branch. Now, these are all the ways not to prune evergreens. They've lion-tailed these. They've removed all the inside branches. Again, if that branch breaks during a storm, there's no options to prune back to. You now have to remove it at the trunk. He's doing the right thing. It's what we call the one-cut basil method. At that point, you might as well cut the tree down. Let's say this is a 35-year-old tree. Imagine if this tree still had all of its branches. The center of its gravity is going to be about a third of the height of the tree. Now, you've removed the bottom third of this tree, and the center of its gravity has now been moved up to the top 2/3 into the top, a third of the way from the top. You've now created a top-heavy tree, and especially in spruce trees that are very shallow-rooted. We had 100-mile-an-hour straight-line winds in Scottsbluff and Mitchell last summer, the summer before. My colleagues went, they did a big survey, they counted 200 trees. 48% of them were blue spruce trees that had blown over because somebody lifted them because, oh gosh, you gotta take care of the weeds. I gotta lift those branches so I can take care of the weeds underneath them. Let me tell you, you just amplified your problem tenfold because for 30 to 40 years, you've had birds and other animals sitting in that tree, dropping seeds, and you now have this nice, big, beautiful seed bank sitting underneath that tree. And you have now, those seeds can sit there dormant for years underneath that tree. You've now removed all of the competition. You've exposed it to direct sunlight. I bet the sprinklers are now moving over that. You've just created the perfect environment for that weed seed bank to just flourish. So you think you're solving a problem and you're really creating a much worse problem. This one, to be fair, I'm pretty sure that they were like on break and they were coming back to remove the rest. At least I really hope that was the scenario. I don't know if they're going for a palm tree or what, but don't prune evergreens like this. If you absolutely must lift your evergreens, this is the option. Don't do this. And you can see all these stub cuts. So especially stub cuts. Don't leave stub cuts. So I want to review a couple of trees. When I started with the Forest Service in 2019, I got to go up shortly after 2020. This is a big, beautiful concolor fir. If you want to plant a blue spruce tree, don't plant one. Plant a concolor fir or a white fir. If you want to see a massive, I'm sure you have some here in North Platte, but if you're ever at Curtis College, right on the south side of the Union is this massive, beautiful concolor fir. They're very drought tolerant. They look just like a blue spruce tree. They smell like citrus when you cut them open. But anyways, this tree is north of Crawford at the cemetery, no irrigation, top of the hill, sandy as heck soil, just the roughest, toughest conditions you could ask a tree to grow in. I was very pleased to see that whoever was managing that space at the time was doing some reduction pruning to keep the branches off of these. This is a 65-year-old tree. It was the stone, it's in like the box with the stone. So we assume that it's affiliated. Now, I got an assistant hired in 2024, and I wanted to show him this brilliant tree, and turnover happened. Somebody new was managing the cemetery, and they decided that they just had to lift the canopy to keep it from touching those stones and everything else. First of all, this is what we found when we showed up. We could not morally leave without fixing all of those stub cuts. And so that's what Caden's doing here, is he's going back in and he's cleaning up all the stub cuts. But now you've got this tree. So looking at this previous picture, here's the shadow line of that canopy on that stone. Here's the shadow line, not even close to the stone. You've now exposed that root system that's been living for 65 years at the top of a hill with no irrigation and sandy soil. It's created its own microenvironment to be able to maintain moisture around its root system, and you've now lifted it up and exposed it, and the amount of airflow that's going through the bottom of that tree and all of the seeds that were living under, just sitting there dormant, waiting for exposure. Again, I'm curious to see what the health of this tree looks like in a couple of years. I'm guessing it's going to slowly start going downhill. And then people comment, they're like, what happened? You did. Okay, so then I went and drove around North Platte last night, and I snagged some pictures. So you might recognize a couple of these things. This is forever going to now live in my pruning slides. This is impressive.
You're welcome.
So here's our power lines. Here's a honey locust, and all I could see was this like sheared edge. And I thought, man, I gotta get out of the car. I gotta go look at this. And the closer I got to it, the worse it got. Because here's all of these sucker sprouts that have come off at all the cuts, and then this big one is like chopped off up here kind of arbitrarily at the top. So basically, if it was pruned properly the first time and made a nice cut, if you look at this closer, and I thought I had the picture in here, there are bore holes all over that stub cut. But there is still a little bit of stored food in that living layer underneath the bark, and that's what's feeding those sprouts. And now the sprouts are feeding themselves. Eventually the tree, it's dead. It just doesn't know that it's dead yet. The tree will continue to throw sprouts as long as it has food stored in that layer. Once it finally burns out and it's done, so there's probably rot. The chances of the rest of this tree having a complete failure during a storm, all of those coming off over the sidewalk or the street, that's the tree you're going to revisit during a storm, because those are going to peel off. I don't know that this was from North Platte. I had some from Gehring also. But here's all these stub cuts, all these dead branches that have now been created. This is the branch here, and I thought, man, at least they went back to the next branch. But then you can see these two stub cuts. Those are not going to callus over. Those are just going to have rot and death that come back into the middle of it. This one on the side should have been just taken back to this attachment. So now this tree has to be pruned probably on an annual basis, if not every other year. Whereas if it's pruned properly the first time, you probably don't have to come back to it for 3 to 5 years. This one really just kind of, not only did they cut it wrong once, but it was also cut wrong another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more times. It's just going to keep sprouting until it dies, and then when it's dead, it's going to be really brittle, and it's going to break, and it's going to end up in your street. Whereas if it was just pruned back to the next branch attachment or removed off to the primary branch, you wouldn't have this sprout regrowth. This was a honey locust that was arbitrarily chopped at the end. All the sprouts that have come off of it over time, some of the side branches, this whole thing is now dead. So again, when you prune trees improperly, you are increasing the amount of work that you have to do, and you're increasing the amount of risk that tree is going to have down the road as it regrows with these weakly attached branches or has these dead branches. This one, I do remember, this isn't Gehring. This just kills me. How many, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, maybe 13 cuts. We could have solved that with 1. That is a primary branch. It's growing underneath the pallet. Just take it off. Take the whole thing down. There's already 2 other stems. This was like a 3-stem multi-thing, hackberry, just a mess that was a weedy tree that the bird planted. It should have never been there, but it was allowed to grow. They will absolutely be back next year to prune all the sprouts off, because the sprouts are just going to come right back up into that tree. Whereas if it was pruned at the base and you leave these other 2, because right now what's going to happen is that this has that stored energy underneath the bark that it's going to use up first, and then it's going to sprout to try and keep providing that stored food. And once it runs out, you've got these other 2 branches that are going to keep feeding it. So you've now just created a perpetual problem that you're going to be dealing with over and over again. Here's another one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Maybe another one on the other side, when we could have just done one back to the next branch that's attached to it. Okay, dead zone. Especially on blue spruce and pine trees. Do not prune back to the dead zone. Nothing will happen. Here's all these ends that were cut off to provide clearance for the alleyway. At that point, those branches have to go back to the trunk, which is not ideal. They're not that big of branches, so at least we're not removing, significantly large branches with a lot of heartwood in them. They're smaller, but those will be dead stubs for the rest of that tree's life. They might have a few little tiny sprouts that come off of it, and that's fine. Now, this is kind of hard to see, but there is a picture line here. This is the tree next to it. That tree is this one right here. This is a white spruce. White spruce have naturally little green sprouts going from the trunk all the way to the tip of the branch. So they don't have as big of a dead zone. So you actually can't see it very well, but this branch here was cut back right here. But it already has a living branch. All of those side little sprouts are going to replace what was lost. So if the branches still have a bunch of green left on them, you can prune back to that. But if there is nothing growing, do not prune into the dead zone. It's going to do nothing other than look ugly and piss off homeowners. They did not take the weight off that branch. Now you have all these sprouts. They're going to end up right back. This one is a little hard to see. We have this branch that's probably 6 inches in diameter, and it was arbitrarily cut off here. And now you have these like 6-foot long sprouts that are coming off in every single direction. Remember that picture I showed you, the ice, and they all just peeled back? That's what's going to happen to that branch. If it was pruned back to the next primary branch, or if it absolutely must be taken off at the trunk, you're going to reduce the long-term need for managing and maintaining those branches. These were here in North Platte. So here's a hackberry. Remember I said hackberry really are terrible at stopping decay from moving throughout the dead tissue, throughout the heartwood. So on a hackberry, anytime you prune a branch big enough to have heartwood in it, the likelihood of you having decay going back in is really high. Really high. So you can see here's the fungus, the rot. Here's a hole. The squirrels really love you. You're making them all kinds of new homes. But when a branch is removed, this is probably a 4-inch branch that was cut back to the primary, it seals over. And you don't have rot going back down into that branch. Same thing would go for like a honey locust, or not honey locust, silver maple. Okay, so back to pruning trees when they're young to prevent these problems from happening. Here's a candelabra. I've got a leader here, and a leader here. This one's actually taller than the central one. I don't need to take them off all the way. I still need them to provide food, so I just need to slow them down. I need to bring them back to one of these side branches that's pointed outward and growing out that way. So turn them into branches, not leaders. Same thing with this one. I've got a leader here, and a leader here. These ones are, you've got that nice like hierarchy happening on this side. That one's fine. So bring this branch back to either that one or back to this one, because what that's also going to do is it's going to open up that area for those upper branches to fill in. And you're going to have shorter, stronger branches rather than having a really long lever arm that's likely going to snap in the next storm. This tree forgot the other half. And if that's not a candelabra, I don't know what is. Again, I've got all my leaders up here at the top and attached to the bottom of the canopy. I also don't have a very nice balanced tree. However, this tree is probably only 6 feet tall. So every one of those is temporary. But I don't want them to keep getting bigger, and I don't want them to keep getting longer because somebody's going to cut it off anyways. So by slowing them down while the tree's young, we've got 2 leaders. I just need to slow one of them down. When you're picking which one to keep, whichever one is more straight line attached to the trunk is the one that you typically want to keep. Usually there's one that like goes off a little bit. Keep the one that is a straight line attached to the trunk as much as possible. This is Scotts Bluff. You guys, what department are you in? Okay, street department, parks. Say that again. Electric? Okay, you should really know the answer to this. How tall is that light post? This is at Menards in Scotts Bluff in the parking lot. How tall is this light post? Roughly. Right, 25 to 30 feet tall. Can anybody tell me what kind of tree this is by looking at it? It's a locust tree. How big do locust trees get? When they reach their full mature size, 60 feet. This tree hasn't even met its half mature size. And I've got branches, one, here's a leader, here's a leader, here's a leader, here's a leader, attached to the bottom of the canopy, all at the same spot on the trunk. And I thought, man, these trees really need to be pruned. Like, somebody's got to come and get these things back in check. Well, the guy mowing had pruned them. But what he did was he stood in the middle and he cleared out all of the lower branches that were going to affect him while he was mowing. These branches left unchecked will continue to get bigger and bigger because they're not slowed down, and this tree is going to be short, fat, and wide. The likelihood of this tree reaching 60 feet, I don't think is very high, because I'll show you its neighbor in just a second. Could this tree be fixed at this point? I think so. I think it could still be worked on. These branches would have to be significantly reduced because the leader we want is probably the weakest, skinniest branch in the whole canopy. So it needs to be put back in order. It can be, but I need that to continue to get taller and taller because otherwise this tree is never going to reach 60 feet. Now that tree is right there, and this is the neighbor. So it had another branch coming off of this side exactly attached to the same spot, and all it took was one snow-heavy load, and it peeled all the way down the trunk. Because of the size of that branch compared to the trunk, they just peel, especially on locusts because they've got a lot of moisture in that growing layer right underneath the bark. Now, this is a linden. You can see it's got 2 leaders going on here. A lot of times they're pretty good about not having 2 leaders, but at this point, you actually just remove that leader completely. We're not worried about trying to make it a branch. It needs to be just completely removed. So our pruning summary is to prune early to promote and develop good structure, prune small to minimize decay, remove the branches with included bark if you can, or reduce the weight on them. Try and remove codominant leaders by turning one of them into a branch first. If that's not an option, then remove the second leader entirely. Remove any of your dead, diseased, and decayed branches back to a collar so that tree can try and seal over that injury that you've created. Maximize the photosynthesis, which is maximizing the factory, the food factory. Don't over prune the trees. And of course, trying to maintain as much balance as possible. Sometimes when you're dealing with a tree that's going way too close to a line, you don't have a lot of options. You're going to have to prune that side of the tree off anyways. But you're better off pruning it back properly than pruning it back to where it's just going to sprout again, and those sprouts are going to end up in your lines in the next storm. So that's all I've got for you. Did you learn something? Yes.
So, at my house, I have a peach tree.
Yep.
And my mom had had a wire wrapped around the main branches.
Okay.
Up, and there's another branch really out. And you had it supported by some wood and speech and things. So when she passed, my brother took that wire off. they had like some green up there, so it wasn't doing real good. He thought it was not good.
Prune it off.
Now all died.
Yeah.
And from that source of that water got it all split. But that's like 40% of the tree. Am I allowed?
So dead branches don't count towards the percentage of removal because they're not doing anything. They're not actively making any food. So whenever a wire or a string, and especially like when you buy the tree from the nursery, you bring it home to plant it. A lot of times they have a cane attached to them to keep them upright and straight and growing, because of course they had to force that tree to grow that way. So they've got it tied and it's got plastic all the way up the top. The number one first thing you should do when you get that tree home is cut every single one of those plastic ties. Because if you don't cut those plastic ties, it's going to choke out that tree. It's going to stop that tree from being able to move those nutrients up and down. If you take it off and the tree is still bending, you can reattach it to the cane with some painter's tape. Only go around it like twice, because over time the painter's tape will break down and it'll separate as the tree gets bigger. Now then, of course, you want to go back and take the cane off. In that situation where you've got probably the primary leader that had a wire on it, and over time it choked it, and so that's why that branch is not doing very well, your best option is to remove that branch, so that way you can have a callus going over the top of it. You're going to have a really wonky shaped tree. That's not a lot you can do about it, but the branch that you have supported by the board, it needs to be shortened. Because if you don't shorten it, it's going to keep getting longer and more weight, and the likelihood of it peeling off the trunk is really, really high, especially if it loads with peaches. All of your fruit trees, anything like apples, cherries, peaches, pears, I don't know how many pears you guys have, plum, the branches need to be kept as short as possible. Because otherwise, when they fruit load, all of that is going to pull them, they're going to split, and then you're going to have a tree that's got all these open wounds that it's trying to manage all at the same time. And it's not, it can't, there's so many different fungus and disease and viruses that attack our fruit trees that every single one of those wounds is a doorway of opportunity to affect that tree and reduce its ability to actually produce anything. So in that situation, you got to work with what you have and make the best of a really unfortunate situation. So.
Most of the dead branches don't count for 25%.
Yep, the dead branches do not count towards the 25%. I was like, what is that noise? Okay. Wow, what time is it? 10:30.
10:30.
You want to take a break and then go over to the park?
Yeah.
Okay. Don't forget to grab some of those different handouts back there. Even if you take them home and only use them at home.
And from those that only